Hey guys, so today we're going to talk about chapter 10, which is about phylogeny and systematics. Um, Essentially, this chapter is about taxonomy, or it's about classifying organisms. But when we talk about systematics, we're not only talking about classifying organisms, but we're talking about grouping those organisms as well, okay, based on their evolutionary history and similarities and such. Let's talk about taxonomy first. So you guys should have all had exposure to this in biology. Taxonomy, basically by definition, is that formal naming system for naming and classifying species in order to illustrate evolutionary relationships. When we talk about taxonomy, we're mainly focusing on, again, the formal naming system and classifying species. When we talk about systematics, it's a little bit different. We're not only going to be naming those species and classifying them, but we're going to do it based on their similarities and based on where they live as far as the world goes, so their biogeography or their life distribution, etc. The three goals that systematic zoologists have that they want to accomplish is one, they want to first of all discover all species, which we're discovering new species every year. So that hasn't happened yet because species keep evolving and changing, and they keep finding ways to go deeper in the ocean and such to find new species. They want to reconstruct the evolutionary relationships of those species, and they want to classify animals according to those evolutionary relationships. So discover all species, reconstruct how they're related, and then classify them based on how they're related. Makes sense, right? When we talk about taxonomy, we talk a lot of the time about classification. Um, we'll talk about that in a second because taxonomy is the art of classifying organisms. But when we talk about evolutionary theory and we apply it to taxonomy, then the role kind of changes from just classifying species to classifying them based on their evolutionary relationships. When we talk about systemization, instead, we place units in classification based on their evolutionary descent. So if you're just doing it based from a taxonomy standpoint or classification, you might just look at their traits, right? Like what color are these? What similarities and traits do they have? Whereas when we're actually trying to systemize, we're actually using evolution and common descent or their DNA or biochemical structure to arrange them. In classification, taxonomists ask whether a species contains defining features, so how they're similar based on color, based on maybe if they have fangs or not, etc. Whereas in systemization, we're actually looking at, okay, are these closely related enough to be in the same groups? When we talk about classification, we talk about taxonomy, it's almost impossible to not recognize Carolus Linnaeus. You guys should have talked about him in biology. He was the one that designed the hierarchy classification scheme that we use today. They call it the Linnaean system because his name was Linnaeus. And that system is, you can include domain on here if you want to, but it's kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And you could also say domain at the top. This is a little bit outdated, okay? The way I remember this is King Philip came over for good spaghetti. If you want to add domain at the top, then you could put Don, like Italian spaghetti. Don King Philip came over for good spaghetti. Okay. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. The kingdom that we study in zoology is Animalia, or the animal kingdom, and we look at some of the different phyla that belong to that animal kingdom. But first, we're going to talk about classification and taxonomy as a whole before we get to those different phyla. As I already mentioned, all animals are placed in kingdom Animalia. It says names of animal groups that each rank in a hierarchy are called taxa or taxon. Taxa is the plural, taxon is the singular. Each of these ranks is referred to as a taxon. If I say the plural, we say taxa. This table is in your book. It shows you, again, those rankings, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Sometimes there's subphylums, subclasses, suborders, etc. that belong to those, but we're just going to focus on the bolded or the main ones. When we name species, we use this system called binomial nomenclature. It's a two-part naming system. You guys will use this system when you do your dichotomous key practice. Bi means two, so it just means two-part naming system. And the way that you name organisms is by their genus and their species. So by their last two taxa ranks, or their genus, taxon, and their species. So for instance, humans are Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens. I don't know why I said homeo. I was thinking of homeostasis. Homo sapiens, okay? A dog would be Canis familiaris. One scientific name that you guys are already familiar with that you may not realize is a scientific name, Tyrannosaurus rex. It translates to tyrant lizard king. Tyrannosaurus being the genus, rex being the species. For humans, Homo is the genus, sapiens is the species. For dogs, Canis is the genus, familiaris is the species. They also have wolves, which is Canis lupus. Since dogs and wolves are closely related, they belong to the same genus, but they're not the same species. The way that you write scientific names is the first word or the genus is capitalized, the second word or the species is lowercase, and the entire thing should be in italics. If you can't do italics because it's on the computer, you would underline it, okay? So for instance, if I was writing this on the whiteboard at school, Canis lupus, that would be the proper way to write a wolf. Canis familiaris, that would be the proper way to write a dog. But if I'm typing it, I can use italics instead. Canis lupus, Canis familiaris. Okay? Genus is always capitalized, species is always lowercase. Sometimes they have a trinomial name instead of a binomial name. That just means that it's probably like a subspecies or subgroup. And they add a third name to it instead of two parts. Now, one thing they talk about a lot in this chapter is species. Okay, so what is a species? Well, defining a species can be difficult. The criteria that we define what a species is off of is their common descent or how they're related as far as evolutionary characteristics go. And they also talk about how members of a species must be able to form a reproductive community that excludes other species. So they should be able to produce offspring with each other, but not with what we would consider not to be the same species. So in your book, they talk about different species concepts, okay? So concepts of what is defined by the word species. So the first one would be the typological species concept, and this concept is the most archaic or ancient one. This one says that we can say what a species is based on certain characteristics of the ideal form of that species. Okay, so essentially in the typological species concept, you identify whether or not something is the same species based on comparing it to, is it similar enough to the ideal form of that species or the type specimen. Okay, so in your heads right now, think of a tiger. You got it? Okay. So you probably thought in your heads, looking at a tiger, you're probably thinking of the whiskers, you probably think of the orange and black stripes, okay? You are thinking of the most common or the ideal form of what a tiger is. So what everyone thinks of what a tiger to be, right? But a tiger isn't necessarily orange and black stripes. Sometimes you have white tigers. Sometimes you have tigers that have different characteristics than that. But the black and orange tiger we would be considered to be the type specimen or the ideal form. So basically in the typological species concept, this is what a tiger looks like. If you have something that looks similar to this, it's a tiger. That's how you identify a species. Biological species concept takes this a step further. It's a bit different. Okay, in the biological species concept, you're trying to say that a species is a reproductive community of populations that occupies a specific niche or a role in nature. Okay, so biological takes it a step further. You're not just comparing it to the ideal physical form, you're also saying that these organisms can reproduce to each other and they have a certain role in nature. All right, now This is fine. It's good. It's a good start. But the problem with it is it lacks a temporal dimension. What that means is that it's leaving out certain organisms that can be a species. There's some organisms out there that aren't a reproductive community. They are able to reproduce on their own. They don't reproduce with other organisms, and those are still species. So we can't really use this one because it leaves that out. It lacks that temporal dimension. We have the evolutionary species concept. This one is pretty good because this doesn't lack that temporal dimension. It includes all past and present organisms, not just present ones that could reproduce. So it states that a single lineage of ancestor descendant populations maintains its identity from other lineages and has its own evolutionary tendencies and historical fates. This is better than the biological one because this accommodates both reproductive communities or sexual reproduction as well as asexual, and it accommodates fossils too. Whereas in the last one, if you're a fossil or if you're ancient, you wouldn't be counted as a species. Last one is the phylogenetic species concept. This is good like the evolutionary one too. They define a species as an irreducible grouping of organisms distinguishably distinct from other such groupings within which there is a parental pattern of ancestry and descent. So again, both asexual and sexual groups are covered. As far as phylogenies go, they're essentially trees of life. So a major goal of systematics is to infer the evolutionary tree or the tree of life or the evolutionary history of species or what's related to those species. So when we study zoology and we study organisms, we study phylogenies as well. We'll look at some of those. Again, a phylogeny is basically a tree of life. They're kind of similar to a cladogram. If you guys have ever used those before, we'll be practicing those in zoology. You should have practiced in biology as well. Uh, but they basically group organisms based on some different things. They group them on their morphological traits or their characteristics as far as their physical form goes. They group them on their chromosomal traits or their chromosomes, their molecular biology, and as well as their behavior or their ecology. When we have shared characteristics that result from common ancestry, we call those homologies. So, for instance, the bones of your arm, and you studied this in biology. If you took biology with me, I know that Mr. Stala teaches this as well. The bones in your arm are homology to the bones in a cat's arm, to the bones in a whale's arm. Those are homologies. They're results of shared common ancestry. This is different from analogies where it could be the same purpose but different evolutionary history. It says a potential misconception in constructing phylogenies is similarities due to convergent evolution or analogies. Okay. Convergent evolution means that you arrived at the same solution to a problem, but it's not based on shared ancestry. So that would be an analogy. So when we talk about homologies, we say the bones in your arm are the same as the bones in a cat and a whale and a crocodile, etc. Analogies would be like the wings of a butterfly and the wings of a bat, right? They both arrived at the same solution to a problem. They both developed flight and wings, but bats and butterflies don't have wings because of shared ancestry. They arrived at that solution independent of each other. This is basically the same thing. Just says that those structures are called homoplasy. So wings of a butterfly and wings of a bat would be a homoplasy because it's the same solution independent of each other. Okay. I'm going to cut this off now because I'm about to run out of my 15 minutes, so I'm going to upload a second video for the rest of this.